Good evening.
Hi, Rabbi.
How are you?
All right. You guys snowed in up there?
Nope, no snow at all.
Really? Wow. I'm impressed. Is the pool open?
No,
No.
there is there is ice on the pool.
Oh, okay. Who are your buddies in the picture with you on this? There are two people in the picture with you for this page.
Oh, fellow rabbis,
Oh, really?
Rabbi uh, David Evan Marcus, and Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt.
Oh, okay. Are they from around your neck of the woods?
No, they're
No.
they're colleagues from all over the world. But
Uh-oh.
I'm just going live on Facebook. Okay, and then we will be good to go.
I hope there's more we than this.
Why? This is fun.
Two of us? I
That's a
could drive.
that's a chavruta.
I could drive you nuts just by yourself.
Not a chance. Not a chance. I am delighted to be able to learn with you. So, and I've chosen particularly a little extra challenging material because this is supposed to be, call it not so introductory, but easy access, but deeper thinking.
Oh, God. I'm in trouble.
Oh, you won't be in trouble at all.
Deeper thinking. I'm in trouble, Rabbi.
So, all right. Well, with that, it's 8:01, so we might as well start. So we're going to say our blessing for learning, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah,
Torah.
which is praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with your commandments. You offer us this idea that the give and take of ideas, of thinking, of the intellect might actually transform the world. And so we say, la'asok b'divrei Torah, to engage in the business of matters of Torah, hoping to move from thinking to doing. And with that, I am a little ambitious today. This week's Torah reading is Va-Eira, and Va-Eira is our second Torah reading in the book of Exodus. And it starts out in the middle of a discussion between God and Moses. And we're going to find out all the context of it. But we are already, the first Parsha, the first week's reading of Exodus, took us deep into the story. We are already past the original burning bush story, although we'll go back to it this week. And we are into, call it the crisis of confidence on Moses's part, and also the crisis of getting the Israelites out. It turns out it's not so easy. So here's where we're going to start. We're going to start with a little Hebrew. This is, we are looking at a copy of Michael Karasik's wonderful book, The Commentator's Bible, which is a large book on the book, 5 large volumes on reading Torah with commentary. And I hope all my colleagues who see this, that this is useful for all of you, because it's always nice to have something early in the week on the Torah portion to get ourselves started in the rest of the week as we head towards Shabbat. So here we are. This is Parshat Va-Eira. It starts in Exodus chapter 6, verse 2. And the Hebrew reads here, Vaydaber Elohim el Moshe lemor elav ani Adonai. And God spoke to Moses saying, I am God. Va-Eira el Avraham el Yitzhak. I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac. Ve'el Yaakov, ve'el Shaddai, ushmi Adonai lo nadati lahem. And to Jacob, as with the name El Shaddai, but my name Adonai I did not make known to them. So this is interesting. This is an opening that somehow or another our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they knew God, but they didn't know, but they knew God, as Rashi says, as El Shaddai. But Rashi responds to this, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Adonai, the Tetragrammaton. And here's Rashi's comment on this very interesting thing. It does not say, I did not make this known to them, but I did not make myself known to them by that name. That is, I did not make myself known to them in my aspect of utter truthfulness and reliability, which is represented by the Tetragrammaton. For I made them these promises, but did not fulfill them. Wow. It's a pretty interesting idea for Rashi, for our medieval commentator from the 11th and early 12th century, to say that God did not fulfill God's promise. And of course, we have to imagine God saying that because we know that that's the case. We are stuck here with this idea that God made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but where did they end up? Here we are at the beginning of Exodus, and the Israelites have ended up in Egypt. They are not a great people. They have not inherited the land. They are people who are enslaved. And that hardly qualifies as having fulfilled that promise. So God continues in the Hebrew, V'gam hakimoti et priti, and also I established my covenant, my brit, itam, with them, latet lahem et eretz Canaan et eretz migorehem asher garuva, v'gam ani shamati. Okay, sorry, let me translate that. So I made my covenant with them to give to them the land of Canaan, the land in where they dwelled, where they sojourned, the land of their dwelling, where they sojourned in it. So this is a doubling. Hey, Sadie. Good night, Sadie.
Night, Dada.
I love you.
Love you too.
We're learning this week's Torah reading.
How many people are on Zoom?
Just Bob and me right now. Yeah. You don't remember Bob, but you met him a long time ago. He lives in South Carolina, not far from where we lived in Charlotte.
That explains it.
Uh-huh. Good night, Sadie. Sleep well.
I just need to get you good night. I've done it, Daddy.
Great. So we've got the covenant with the Israelites, where they lived, and they were supposed to inherit Canaan, where they dwelt. And then it says God is fulfilling the next promise here in verse 5. In verse 5 it says, V'gam ani shamati et nakaat b'nei Yisrael asher mitzrayim ma'avidim otam ve'ezkor et briti. And also I heard the crying out of the Israelites, which was made to them, which because it's strange, which the Egyptians are enslaving them, and I will remember, and I remembered my covenant. So here, you can see the translation here in verse 5. I've now heard the moaning of the Israelites because of the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Verse 5 over here in the OJPS, it says, and moreover, I have heard the groanings of the Israelites, the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I've remembered my covenant. Now, if you wonder why I stumbled a little in the translation there, it's really, so the opening is easy. V'gam is and also, ani is I, shamati is I heard, Et nikat b'nei Yisrael, this is a compound noun, the crying out of the children of the descendants of Israel. I like to say Israelites because we are all descendants of Israel. And then we have this, a very simple conjunction here. This is asher, which is that, or which. So the Israelites, which or who, and then we have Mitzrayim, the Egyptians enslaving them is really what we've got here. So that doesn't quite make sense in English. So we had to come up with, right? So the NJPS translates that or which into because. I heard their moaning because the Egyptians are holding them. The OJPS translates that conjunction whom, which is closer, I think. It's not really because. But in any event, it's not easy to, the syntax and the vocabulary is hard to match up here. But what's really interesting is the last phrase, the last clause. And I remembered my covenant. All right. What happens here is fascinating because we've got God saying, I only remembered my covenant after I heard them calling out. Their suffering was happening when they cried out, I heard. This gives us so much trouble that Ibn Ezra goes so far as to say, I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites, indicating that they have repented. This is still another reason why I have sent you. They've repented. What did they do wrong? So here we see that our scholars, our medieval scholars, are struggling with the enslavement of the Israelites. And we have Ibn Ezra, our Spanish scholar from the late 1100s and early 1200s, saying, it is on account of some sin, which we haven't talked about because we haven't been reading Ibn Ezra all along, that they were suffering. Here, Rashi explains the whole verse. I have now, being obligated to fulfill the covenant I established, heard the moaning of the Israelites who are moaning because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered that same covenant. For the covenant between the pieces, I told Avram, I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve. Yeah, Bob.
It sounds like when it says, and I have remembered that covenant, that God was doing something else. I mean, it's like, I'm over here making a sandwich and I went, oh, the covenant. I mean, yes. that's what it sounds like. I don't know what that means.
So the personification of the divine in the Torah is a challenge for those of us who try to encompass a rational idea of the creator of the universe. If we are going to imagine a creator of the universe, of course, we are imagining as 21st century people something beyond our comprehension, something with some kind of omniscience, something with some kind of total knowledge. And yet, we have to understand that the Torah is not written by people who had this idea of omniscience. God does not see everything. Otherwise, God would not go through the Garden of Eden and say to Adam and Eve, where are you? God would not say to Cain, what did you do to your brother? His blood cries out to me from the earth. God is more of a stand-in for a monarchical parental figure who is struggling to figure out how to get along with us in the same way that we are struggling to figure out how to get along with it. And this personalized divine serves many purposes that are different from the rationalistic, even Maimonidean idea of the infinite. Right, Maimonides, who is comes from 1135 to 1215 to give us the idea of Ein Sof, a God without end. But Maimonides is a medieval philosopher in the highest of the academic styles of that time, and therefore he is more than 2,000 years removed from the original writers of the earliest pieces of Torah, who are writing in 900 BCE. And their encounter with the divine is much more personal, and they feel a lot more occasionally vindictive, occasionally inattentive. God makes promises, God forgets about them and gets back to them at a later time after God makes the sandwich. That's the God of the Torah. Much more like Zeus, only without any other sort of interfering gods. And again, we are about to enter the story of Exodus, where God has to prove to the Israelites that God is bigger and better than the Egyptian gods. So it's not just God who doesn't buy into sort of this massive monotheistic idea, it's also the Israelites. The Israelites don't believe that their God is the only God. They're hoping eventually that their God is just the biggest, baddest of the gods and is on their side. So it's a very different God idea. It's one of the challenges in trying to read Torah as if it's the only thing. Right? We've already jumped around in time period in reading Rashi and Ibn Ezra, and we haven't even gotten to Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, who's our focus for this evening. And that will take us into multiple centuries of commentary. All right, continuing on past verse 5. Verse 6. Lachen, אמור לבני ישראל, אני אדוני והוצאתי אתכם מתחת סבלות מצרים. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am Adonai, this name that they don't know me by, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, right? This is this new name for God. And I will bring them out, hotzeti, I will eject them, extract them. And here it's extract you. Extract, actually, technically, Bob, this is a Southern term. This is extract y'all. I still remember how to say it mostly correctly. A single syllable. Extract y'all from under the suffering of the Egyptians, and I will redeem you. I will save you from slavery, and I will or deliver here and redeem or save you with an outstretched arm, zroa nituya, and with great judgments. So, which is translated slightly different. It's great judgments over here on the right, but it is extraordinary chastisements, which I suppose is one way of talking about the plagues. And then God continues, V'lakachti, and I will take etchem, you, for me, for a people, and I will be for you, for God, for a God. Or it doesn't even say, I will be for you, for God, and you will know me. For I am Adonai, your God. I am Adonai, your God. Ki ani Adonai Elohechem, hamotzi etchem, the one who brought you mitachat, from under the suffering of the Egyptians. And I will bring you, v'heviti etchem, el haaretz, to the land, asher nasati et yadi, that I swore by my hand, latet ota, to give it to Avraham, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, Venatati ota, and I will give it lachem, to you, morasha, an inheritance. And how do we know God is serious? Because then God repeats, Ani Adonai, I am God. So then the conclusion of this piece is Vaydaber Moshe Kain el Bnei Yisrael velo sham'u el Moshe miksor ruach ume'avoda kasha. And this is like the real big clincher here. And Moses spoke this way, thus, Cain, to the Israelites. So Moses takes this message directly to the Israelites. Velo sham'u el Moshe, and they don't hear Moses. Mikotzer ruach, on account of their crushed spirits, their shortened spirits, ume avodah kasha, and the terrible bondage. Here it says their spirits crushed by cruel bondage, but I think honestly the translation on the right comes closer. They hearkened not unto Moses for impatience of spirit, a cut off spirit, and for cruel bondage. So the attention of the Israelites is they cannot listen to Moses. This seems pretty tragic. Here, God sends Moses to help them, and they don't hear. So that leads us to our commentary tonight. Our commentary comes from a book that I truly adore called The Particulars of Rapture, Reflections on Exodus by Professor Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, who is a professor of biblical studies in Israel at the Pardes Institute and has been for many years. And this is our Parsha. This is the opening of her section on this, Va-Eira, the exile of the word is what she calls this. And this is resisting redemption, the crisis of redemption. So she is going to take us back a little before she gets us in, because she's got to set the stage here. So she says, the first stage of the redemption is ended, it seems, in failure and frustration, with Moses protesting to God. Under pressure from a brutalized people who question the authority by which Moses and Aaron have provoked Pharaoh into harsher policies, Moses cries out, since I have come to Pharaoh to speak in your name, Pharaoh has dealt worse with this people. You have not saved your people. In last week's Torah reading, we see in chapter 5, Moses' attempts to free the Israelites lead to worse suffering and worse oppressions. In a subtle movement, Moses speaks of this people and then of your people. This people has an alienated ring. The people become an object of discourse. Your people, on the other hand, suggests relationship, God's concern for human life. It recalls the form that God uses when God first speaks to Moses at the burning bush. I have indeed seen the affliction of my people. So that's all the way back in chapter 3. Perhaps Moses is quietly quoting God back to God's self, as though to say, where now is that empathy of which you spoke so emphatically? That is, the radical nature of Moses's protest lies not so much in its description of objective fact, things have got worse instead of better, as in its tone of dissolution and irony. So this is our opening here. Our stage setting is that Moses goes down to Egypt. Moses makes demands to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh. Things get worse. Moses comes back to God and says, this people, your people, I'm not even going to complain to you, God, about the fact that you sent me and I failed. And clearly, because that's problematic enough. Rather, I'm going to say to you, you sent me and you don't even seem to get this people, your people. There's a big, Moses takes Moses's own self out of the equation and lays the entire problem at God's feet. Needless to say, Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg points out, this is undoubtedly a dangerous moment in Moses's relation to God. I mean, after all, Moses is, back-talking to the divine. God has made promises, has essentially told a story that begins in empathy and ends in a land flowing with milk and honey. The empathy, I feel the pain, I've heard the suffering, and I'm going to take you back to where I promised you, which we see over and over again. Now, Moses reports a demonic narrative in which events turn toward tragedy, a narrative of evil, failure to save, the perverse effect of his mission. In this micro-narrative, God's empathic declarations are placed in ironic quotation marks. You have, in fact, not saved your people. You can almost see Moses putting the air quotes there. Right? Moses is frustrated. Moses didn't want the job to begin with. And now he's sent, and it turns out to be harder, much more difficult than it was advertised. God had sort of sold Moses on the idea, don't worry, I'll be with you, I'll help you, and it doesn't work. The situation then is not a promising one. In Rashi's words, Moses has spoken harshly to God. God responds by reaffirming God's promises and by emphasizing God's name. I am Adonai. God links God's commitment to save the people with God's unfulfilled promises to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, that's how the whole parsha opens up, going back to the beginning where we started. Right? The opening here is God spoke to Moses. The opening of this is, I am God. I was there for your ancestors, right? This is, somewhere between, here what she's referring to is that Rashi is calling, God is calling Moses to account, right? God called Moses to account for Moses's harsh question prior in chapter 5, why did you bring harm upon this people? The sages have explained when Moses asked God, why did you bring harm upon this people? God said to him, what a pity that the patriarchs are no more. How I mourn their deaths. I appeared to them many times as El Shaddai, and they never asked me, what is your name? But you said to me, when they ask me, what is God's name? What will I say to them? So God, through Rashi and through the Midrash, is angry at Moses because Moses keeps on asking him hard questions. And so here we have this other context when God says, they only knew me by the name El Shaddai. They didn't know me by this more powerful name, but they didn't ask me any questions. They weren't bugged by me. What's your beef, Moses? How come you can't just get it right? Why are you so difficult? So that's what Professor Gottlieb Zornberg is referring to here. There is even perhaps, she continues, an answering irony in God's words. I too have heard the moaning of the Israelites. You are not the only sensitive observer on the scene, but at their core, God's words are a renewed message to the people, a narrative of insistent, dynamic hope, with 4 verbs of redemption that lead the imagination from the past to the future. And we read this and it was big, right? I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will save you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through great acts of judgment. I will take you for me as a people, right? I will free you, I will save you, I will redeem you, I will take you for me, right? So, but here, that's not to the people of Israel, that's to Moses. God is actually giving the people of Israel a pep talk through Moses. And this is the message that Moses brings to the people. But once again, there is the paralyzing jolt of failure. All God's bounteous synonyms for redemption are met with blankness. Moses spoke thus, in just this way, to the descendants of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses out of shortness of spirit and hard labor. And the narrative grinds heavily to a halt, right? We've got this, Moses gets the pep talk from God. God chastises Moses. There's this sort of halftime, reset. And Moses goes back out there and immediately gets tackled for a loss, and the Israelites score a safety. I mean, it's terrible. Moses cannot get anywhere with them. After changing direction, God now tells Moses, go speak to Pharaoh. We didn't get to this, but I'll show it to you now. Right? This is this next part. Here we are in verse 10. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, ba, daber el Paro melech Mitzrayim, vayishlach et bnei Yisrael me'artzo. So here it says up here, that's close. It says, and God, Adonai spoke to Moses saying, come, go and tell Pharaoh, speak to Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians, to have him send the Israelites from his land. And what happens then? Vaydaber Moshe lifnei Adonai lemor. And so Moses says, and it says, Moses spoke before Adonai, saying, so Adonai lemor, hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elav, va'ech yishma'eni paro. Look, I spoke to the Israelites. They didn't listen to me. How is Pharaoh going to listen to me? If the Israelites didn't listen to me, how is Pharaoh? And what does he say? He says, Ba'ani aral svatayim, because I am circumcised of lips. Yeah, and it's one of those, I am uncircumcised of lips. Aral svatayim. I have uncircumcised lips, whatever that means, right? So here, the newer translation tries to backpedal it a little, saying a man of impeded speech, but the older translations calls it like it is, who am of uncircumcised lips. And finally, the section ends with verse 13. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon vaytzavem el bnei Yisrael ve'el Paro melech Mitzrayim lahotzi et bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. And God spoke to Moses, Adonai spoke to Moses and to Aaron and commanded them to the Israelites, sent them or gave them a charge. This is commanded them to command the Israelites and to Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians, to bring the Israelites from the land of Egypt. So God basically ignores Moses's objection here and says, go and do this anyway. So needless to say, this is where we're going to end up with a very interesting thing. And this is one of the reasons I love this particular commentary, is her bringing forward this thing, this observation. Apparently changing direction, God now tells Moses, go speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that Pharaoh may send the Israelites free from Pharaoh's land. Moses answers, the Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh listen to me? And I am of uncircumcised lips. We just read that. Moses' answer, which again seems to bring the narrative to an impasse, shuts down all the discussion, is one of the classic examples of kal v'chomer, the a fortiori argument in the Torah. So Bob, you love this because this is straight from Talmud. This Talmud uses this as a basic thing. The kal v'chomer is how much more so, right? So this is what if a fortiori, which is the Latin for it, is not, I think, any more helpful to understand it. Kal v'chomer is from a light case to a serious case. If it applies in a smaller case, how much more so does it apply in a major case, right? So here we have Professor Gottlieb Zornberg saying, from a minor to a major premise. Here's a time when it's used, as in Genesis 44:8, right? Even the silver that we found in the mouths of our bags, we brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How then could we have stolen any silver or gold from your master's house? So this is the argument between the brothers of Joseph and Joseph. How could we have stolen anything? All of the silver that we've got here, we brought back to you. We don't have anything else. How could we have stolen anything? Because all that's here is from you anyway. So here too, the logic is clear. If Israel, who had every reason to desire to hear of redemption, have refused to hear me, then how can I expect Pharaoh, whose vested interests are clearly massed against me, to listen to me? So here's the argument that we'd expect Moses to make. We would expect Moses to say, the Israelites have every reason to listen to me about freeing them. They are slaves, right? I say, I'm going to free you. They say, yay, we want to be free. If they say no, if they don't listen to me, God, what makes you think Pharaoh's going to listen to me? But Moses doesn't make that argument. Moses looks like he's beginning to make that argument and then says, at this point, as Professor Gottlieb Zornberg says, at this point, Moses adds the coup de grace to his narrative of futility, and I am of uncircumcised lips. Yes, Bob.
Rabbi, you knew I would ask. I know you knew I would ask, right? Uncircumcised lips.
We have no idea.
What are circumcised lips, and what age do you get them?
We have no idea.
Okay, good.
This is a very strange phrase. It really only occurs in this context in the Torah. We've got no idea. So, I mean, we could spend the whole time talking about what it might mean.
I mean, does it mean he stutters or, has a speech impediment?
Maybe. Yeah. Your guess is as good as mine. So here we have Moses reverting to his original resistance at the burning bush. Moses speaks of himself as one who cannot speak. How then can he expect Pharaoh and in retrospect the Israelites to listen? So Moses goes back to his original protest. I'm not the guy you want. I don't know how to talk this way. I don't, or in the vernacular, I know talk so good. Right? I'm not the mouthpiece that you want. The crisis in the drama of redemption enters its most fraught moment. It could be sketched with a kind of structural simplicity. God's will, God's message of redemption, is blocked by all three human protagonists, by Pharaoh, by the Israelites, and then by Moses himself. Pharaoh and the Israelites are described as not listening. The formula lo shama, he did not listen, indeed will become the leitmotif, the regular repetitive pattern of the whole plague narrative, right? Which will be Pharaoh never listens, Pharaoh never hears. Repeatedly, Pharaoh's surrender to God will be neutralized in these words. An essential deafness inheres in Pharaoh's persona, but the Israelites too, as we have just noticed, are described in terms of deafness. Their deafness is contrasted with Pharaoh's only in being accounted for. It is a product of shortness of spirit and hard labor. In other words, the difference between Pharaoh's deafness and the Israelites is at least we've got an explanation for the Israelites' deafness. No one aside from the only explanation we ever get for Pharaoh not listening is that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But that's not at the start. Here, at the start, We have Pharaoh not listening. Pharaoh has no interest in listening, right? Why would Pharaoh listen? It's not to Pharaoh's advantage. But the Israelites don't listen, and their not listening is a product of this shortness of spirit and the hard labor. What this diagnosis may mean, as well as the enigmatic quality of Pharaoh's deafness, are subjects I explore in this chapter. And Torah comes at the right time always. If we cannot figure out a way to connect Torah to the week in which we read it, we're not paying attention. And here, of course, we exist in a time of deafness and blindness. We do not listen to one another. What happened last week in Washington, D.C. is so many levels of catastrophic unlistening. Not merely the people who refuse to listen to the outcome of the election, but the people who refuse to listen to the warnings that so many people were coming with bad intent to the Capitol building. The people who refused to listen in the moment that more police and military were needed to protect the sacred place of our country. The people listening over the last 5 years to the radical extremism that is growing in this country, that is at the heart of not listening to the suffering that our country has brought to some parts of the country at the expense of others. There is so much deafness. It took a cataclysm, a catastrophe, an act of deliberate mayhem to cause some people to listen a little bit more. And in truth, it will take the plagues, 10 of them, to make the Israelites listen. And it is God who understands this at some point and says, I must increase my miracles so that they will see me as their God. And in all of this, I say, oh, what if we only listened? What if we only stopped and listened and saw past our suffering? I mean, here's Moses showing up, and the Israelites can't hear Moses. And Moses can't speak. And one of the things Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg will focus on is that there is no listening and no speaking of any sort unless everybody is paying attention, unless everybody's in relationship. Moses understands his inability to speak may be, in fact, on account of his having no listeners. If a prophet speaks in the forest and no one is there to hear them, have they spoken? If a prophet speaks to a people who are suffering too much to hear, is there any prophetic message? And so Professor Gottlieb Zornberg says, before I turn to them, however, let me emphasize that Moses too belongs to the complex party of those who block God's message of redemption. In Moses's protest, in his ironic interrogation of God's narrative, in his questioning of the people's fitness for redemption, Moses essentially refuses the role to which God has called him. Now remember that little Ibn Ezra bit, that the Israelites need to repent. Are the Israelites fit for redemption? Do they merit God's efforts to save them, or Moses's for that matter? And that will be another question underlying this. Seems like blaming the victim on the one hand, but on the other hand, they've said, we don't want to be freed to Moses for all intents and purposes. The heart of Moses's refusal is in these last words. I am of uncircumcised lips. Their power and poignancy can be estimated if one asks why he uses this particular form of kal v'chomer logic, the from minor to major logic, mooning from minor to major conclusion. If the If the children of Israel would not listen, how can I expect Pharaoh to listen? That seemed to be fine enough logic. A simpler argument might have been to speak of Pharaoh's proven obduracy, Pharaoh's refusals. Moses and Aaron have already experienced his willful deafness. Who is God that I should listen to God's voice, Pharaoh says in the last chapter. Indeed, this deafness has resulted, as we have noticed, in a tragic tightening of the stranglehold of slavery. Why then should Pharaoh listen the second time? However, this is not the argument that Moses uses. Instead of using the Kal v'chomer from the minor to the major argument, what does Moses say? In his words, the real pain emerges with great clearness, with great lucidity. It is a hearing problem that besets him. To put it very simply, Moses is saying, I cannot make them listen. I am of foreskinned lips. What he is expressing is a sense of impotence. I am incapable of communicating with either of my two audiences. The evidence is devastatingly clear if even those who have an interest in hearing me will not listen. So here is another way of reading the uncircumcised lips piece. If the Israelites will not listen to me, then of course Pharaoh won't listen to me. And that means that I am of blocked speech. My speech is not getting through. There is an obstacle, a foreskin, as it were, between my lips and the hearers. The complexity of Moses' complaint is given additional resonance in the reading of Sfat Emet. Here, Moses links the deafness of both Pharaoh and the Israelites with his own foreskin lips. He says, Sfat Emet, which is a commentary, says, because they would not listen, therefore I am of foreskin lips. So that's what we just looked at. Specifically, speech we normally affirm creates listeners or fails to create them. Here, the converse truth is affirmed. It is the listener who creates the act of speech. The prophet prophesies by dint of the listening of their people. As long as there is no one to listen to God's word, language impotently stutters. In this vein, Sfat Emet recalls the prophetic call, listen, my people, that I may speak in Psalms. That is, your listening will enable me to speak. All of this is a relational situation. If there is no relationship, there is no listening or speaking. The speaking is stopped before it's begun because we stand in front of a crowd of people who are uninterested in hearing what we have to say. And that's quite a powerful situation. Not everybody stands up in front of people. But I think many of us could imagine what it's like to stand up in front of a hostile crowd, a crowd that we know, unless we do something radical, something dramatic, they will not listen under any circumstances. It's one of the reasons why many of us, when we stand up in front of people to speak, will start with a story that humanizes us so that we create sympathy. Moses hasn't done that yet. Moses may even understand that his ability to garner the Israelites' sympathy may be on account of him not having been raised in slavery. Maybe Aaron's advantage in this is not that Aaron is a better speaker, but that Aaron speaks as a fellow slave. Professor Gottlieb Zornberg continues, the pathology described here is what the Zohar calls the exile of the word. The dynamic of language, of communication, has failed. In the Zohar, this failure is the profound meaning of exile. It encompasses the inability to hear and the inability to speak. Moses' speech problem in this context is to be understood as a function of a deeper cultural rupture. The ears of this generation cannot respond to living language. For this reason, Moses cannot speak. Language is in exile. Communication is shut down. It is too great an abyss to bridge with words. The impasse of this moment in which all the protagonists close out the word of God is the essential dilemma of redemption. I would like to explore this crisis of language in which human beings seem to form a phalanx to resist God's narrative. Moses, the Israelites, and Pharaoh are strangely matched in a common resistance. The situation has a surrealistic, even a subversive quality, without villains or heroes beyond good and evil, defying resolution. Right? There's no moving this. There's no protagonist. Everybody is at fault. Every single player is an immovable object, and there is no unstoppable force. God can't move any of them. Goes back, Bob, to your original observation. We're not talking about this classic omniscient, omnipotent God here. We're talking about a God who has to work through us. This, by the way, is an essential theological idea in Judaism, that we are God's agents in the world. But here, God's agents are stymied. There is no assistance that will move it. The most radical imagery used by the Midrash to portray this impasse is of stalled birth. What if the baby refuses to leave the womb? If the mother's body refuses to release? If the natural processes will not proceed to their natural conclusion? So this is a Midrash. This is, hold on, I'll give you the footnote for it. This is, this is Yalkut Shimoni. It's an early medieval Midrash and one of our classical Midrashim. And what does this say? Has God ever ventured to go and take God's self, one nation, from the midst, from the kerev of another? What is the force of one nation from the midst, from the innards of another nation? Like a person who extracts the fetus from the bowels of the mother animal, God brought Israel out of Egypt. As it is said, the innards and the entrails. This is clearly stressful for the delivered, the fetus. How do we know that it is also stressful for the deliverer? And it is said, God took you and brought you out from the iron blast furnace, like one who extracts gold from fire without tongs or gloves. So we have a birthing imagery and a parallel God reaching the divine hand into the middle of the furnace to extract gold from the fire. It hurts everybody. And for those of you who have any experience with animal midwifery, I gather that it's not comfortable to reach into an animal and bring forward a child this way. Oh, I jumped ahead, sorry. A forceps delivery is the violent resolution to the stalled birth. God forcibly removes God's people, torpid, assimilated to the fetal condition, from the deathly hold of the Egyptian mother body. This solution, however, as the Midrash itself, modulating from the birth imagery to the imagery of gold smelting, remarks, is sa'ar l'nishmat v'lo shomet. It means stress for both the deliverer and the delivered. Both God and Israel would emerge from the redemptive moment bearing the marks of trauma. The notion of God's trauma is a radical component of Midrashic and Hasidic thinking. God's suffering registers the pain of a world out of joint, even as it intimates the possibility of a healed condition. And this, I'm going to connect as sort of our concluding message tonight with Valerie Kaur's See No Stranger, which she talks about how in this moment of time, and this moment of time for her is basically the last 20 years, but we could look at it as this moment of time as all of the unsolved injustice in American or world history is a dark time. And she asks, she offers that it doesn't need to be the darkness of the tomb. It could be the darkness of the womb. It doesn't need to be the darkness of death. It could be the darkness of birth. And these painful times don't need to be pains of endings, but pains of beginnings. That the bringing into the world of something new is not a smooth operation. It is charged by difficulty. And we as Jews have identified God as our partner in this. God as a force for creation, but deliberately on God's purpose, not capable, not interested in doing it by itself. That God has created the world in search of partners. And we are the partners right now. And we must brave the pain of this time, brave the darkness of this time, to breathe in and bring something into the light that is better than what's happened before. We must breathe through the pain and make it the pain of birth and renewal and not the pain of death and destruction. There will always be resistance when there is change. Because, as another teacher of mine said, people don't fear change, people fear loss. People fear that the future will mean less for us, will mean something that we value disappearing. And let us build a future where we recognize that we are in this together, that the sum is greater than the parts, and it is only by overcoming our pain, our discomfort, and seeing together through the darkness to a light that we might bring something better into being. In our parsha this week, Moses and Israel and God, and even Pharaoh to a certain extent, need to partner to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. It's not a smooth partnership. It's not painless. And it doesn't go well for ever. It's always a work in progress. And as we undertake this new year and this attempt at redemption together, I hope all of you will join together with me in learning and working together on this work in progress. So with that, I wish everybody a good evening. Bob, as you've seen, all of my new events through Open Door Judaism are available via the updated website, openjudaism.org. That's Open Door Judaism, OPENDOOR Judaism, JUDAISM.org, opendoorjudaism.org. I look forward to seeing everyone in a variety of formats and places. God willing, at some point in the next year, we will actually be able to gather in person. But in the meantime, we're going to have a lot of time together in this new medium. Bob, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi. Check your email.
I will. I have it. I know what you're asking. There will be a P.O. box for you to send things, but you can also make a donation on my website.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
I'll see you tomorrow.
I look forward to it. Take care.
Bye.